So I will now get things going. Michelle, don't forget to unmute yourself when you get when you get the chance. Great. Okay. So it gives me great pleasure to kick off our seminar series for this semester with a speaker from abroad. I think it's the first time in NTU history we've had someone present, certainly in our seminar series, from overseas. Michelle is joining us from California. So Michelle Burnham is Professor of English and Director of the Center for the Arts and Humanities at Santa Clara University in California. She's the author of 3 great books on early American literature, which include works on economics of colonialism, captivity narratives, and most recently, Transoceanic America, Risk, Writing, and Revolution in the Global Pacific, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2019. She's also edited a collection of writing by Helen Hunt Jackson and an edition of the 1767 novel, The Female American. She is the editor of the re-editions series at Lever Press, which is devoted to publishing open access digital editions of recovered texts and writers from literary and cultural history. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Michelle, and I'll hand over to you now.
All right, thank you so much, Christopher, for that introduction, but also for this invitation, and also to the Humanities Seminar Series for hosting and publicizing this event. Thanks to everybody for being here, for listening and engaging. I know it's not only sort of a stressful and distracting time for everybody, but it's kind of early in the day for you guys. So thank you. This is the first time I've given a talk by Zoom, so I'm going to do my best to keep track of my my talk here and my slides. If I get off and you notice it, feel free to warn me. Jump in and warn me. So, all right, it's not quite into my screen. There we go. Okay. So before I begin, I just want to give a little bit of brief context for the talk itself. This talk is based on an article that I just recently completed for a forthcoming collection on American Puritanism. So this talk and that article are not part of a larger project. Instead, it's kind of an extension in a couple of different ways of my recent scholarship. So as Christopher just mentioned, I recently published a book on the Global Pacific and American literary history. That book focused on the age of revolutions at the end of the 18th century. It didn't go back to the 17th century, which is the period that I'm going to be talking about today. Before that book, I published one on 17th century Puritanism and economics. Here's the book Christopher mentioned, and here's the previous book. So this was on the 17th century, but it really focused on Puritanism and economics in an Atlantic context rather than a transoceanic one. So this talk and the article that it draws from sort of gave me a chance to take the transoceanic global spatial framework from my most recent book and kind of import it back into the context of American Puritanism and think about it a little bit differently. Imagining American Puritanism differently has really always been critical to the work that I do as a scholar. As many of you may know, the Puritans traditionally serve as a linchpin in an exceptionalist narrative about America. And those narratives actively suppress truths about inequality and exploitation and slavery. And I think it's especially important now, maybe more than ever, to continue challenging that kind of narrative. So I'm going to get started. There we go. Working on the slide navigation. I'm going to get started with the first part of this talk. This talk has 4 parts to it. I'm aware Zoom is not the world's most dynamic speaking environment, so thank you all for hanging in there with me through these. I want to start with some global networks. I'm beginning with this image, which is the title page of a translation of portions of the New Testament into the Malayan language. It was printed in Oxford, England in 1677. Its translator was Thomas Hyde. He was an English scholar of Oriental languages, and he dedicated this book, the translation, to Robert Boyle. Most of us remember Boyle as a scientist who undertook the famous air pump experiment, as well as for his contributions to chemistry and natural philosophy more generally. But Boyle was also a longtime advocate of translation projects around the world. So more than a decade before Hyde's Malay translation, in 1661, Boyle sponsored the Arabic translation of a book on Christianity. The translator of that work was Edward Pocock. Pocock was an Anglican chaplain who during the 1630s had been stationed in Aleppo, Syria, with the Levant Company. While Levant Company merchants organized and pursued trade between England and the Ottoman Empire, their chaplain, Pocock, collected Arabic texts and manuscripts, and he became expert in its language. He later returned to London and he took up a chair in Arabic created for him at Oxford University by Archbishop Laud. And when Pocock died in 1691, his position at Oxford went to Hyde. So Robert Boyle facilitated and funded these 17th century Arabic and Malayan translations, even though Boyle himself never traveled to Indonesia, Syria, or any other of the far-flung locations around the globe where he campaigned for translinguistic work. He supported these projects and publications from London, where he served on the court of committees that oversaw the East India Company, of which he was a member. Boyle's interest in translation moved through the channels of global merchant companies, and it reached as far westward as it did eastward. Boyle modeled his translation initiatives with the Levant and East India companies on the North American example of the New England Company. In the dedication that opens his Malay translation, Hyde describes Boyle as, quote, one of the directors of the East India Company for Trade and governor of the Corporation for the Propagation of the Gospel and the conversion of the American natives in New England. It was in the latter role that Boyle corresponded with the Puritan missionary, John Eliot. This is a piece out of that dedication in the translation. John Eliot's translation of the Bible into Algonquin appeared in 1663. So before this one, but just 2 years after Pocock's Arabic translation. So you can see in this particular piece the global framework, the identification of the East Indies and the West Indies, the emphasis on translation, both in New England and in Asia, and the mechanism of corporations for making these translations happen. But Boyle and Eliot were actually still corresponding long after this. In her book, The New England Bound, Wendy Warren notes that Eliot wrote to Boyle asking him for help releasing enslaved Native Americans who, after being captured in New England during King Philip's War, had been transported for sale to Tangiers in North Africa. Eliot's appeal to Boyle was not successful. In 1691, the year Hyde took up Pocock's position in Arabic at Oxford, the London Court of Committees, on which Boyle served, also instructed Elihu Yale, who was then governor of the East India Company in Madras, to ensure that weekly prayers and sermons at the city's Protestant church were offered in Portuguese. This effort was designed to reach, quote, the Protestant Black people and Portuguese and the slaves who served them, who have now no place to hear the word of God preached in a language they understand, and therefore are necessitated to go to the popish churches. These plans didn't succeed any more than Eliot's appeal to Boyle on behalf of the enslaved Native Americans did. And it was not long, in any case, before Yale was deposed as governor in Madras. He left behind in India a reputation as an especially ruthless and corrupt merchant, but took with him an immense fortune. The wealth he amassed in Asia, he more famously spent in America, where Yale's donations helped fund the college established by dissenting Puritans in New Haven, Connecticut, that bears his name. By then, New Haven's first governor, the Puritan Theophilus Eaton had long since been buried in the town green. Prior to founding New Haven, Eaton had been a patent holder and president of the Massachusetts Bay Company. But like Yale, his considerable fortune had been accrued earlier while living abroad as a merchant. In his case, not in Madras, India with the East India Company, but in Copenhagen, Denmark with the Eastland Company, which traded with the Baltic states. But the global reach of Connecticut's origins go back farther still. It was established by the Puritan minister Thomas Hooker, who was a client of Robert Rich, the Earl of Warwick. And Warwick was an investor in the East India Company and held positions in the companies that governed all three Atlantic Puritan colonies, including Bermuda, Providence Island, and New England. Warwick's investments and his projects ran through these distant locations, but like Boyle, he never traveled to any of them. So I've just sketched out a series of global networks that I've tried to represent on this slide, just kind of pull together everything I just referenced. These networks are populated by scholars, scientists, and slaves, as well as missionaries, merchants, and ministers. These networks connect London, Europe, Asia, the Middle East, New England, and North Africa through intersecting commercial, religious, political, and intellectual commitments. And these connections reveal relationships between translation and conversion, between commerce and religion, and between English and native peoples. And these connections span from Malaysia to Massachusetts. I'm interested in recovering these kinds of global networks and using them to unseat the narrative monopoly that Puritanism traditionally holds in early American literary and cultural history. This is not an easy monopoly to break up. One excellent effort to do so was Karen Kupperman's 2003 book on the Atlantic Puritan colony of Providence Island, located off the coast of Nicaragua, where she rightly claims that because we have artificially cut up the early English colonial effort into hermetically sealed little units, we have failed to see massive evidence, she says, of an integrated colonial vision that was widely shared on both sides of the Atlantic. We've since become, I think, much more accustomed to imagining colonial New England in less isolated Atlantic ways, but New England and its Puritans remain persistently naturalized, magnified, and centered, especially in curricula and textbooks that cover the colonial period. So despite Kupperman's pretty commanding work in this book, Providence Island itself remains about as absent today from the public imagination of early American history as it always has been. It's nowhere to be seen in the anthologies and surveys designed and used to teach early American literature. So of course, one might reasonably ask, if we haven't yet succeeded in yoking together such sealed colonial units as New England, Virginia, Barbados, Bermuda, and Providence Island into an Atlantic whole, how will we possibly integrate them within a global framework that reaches to Asia and its Pacific and Indian Ocean worlds? If we want to encompass the kinds of histories and networks that were identified in those opening segments, it's not going to be enough, I think, to just stretch further or with greater muscle the stories that currently organize that period. The narrative putty that binds these stories seems able to stretch only so far into new and wider configurations before it just like springs back into more familiar shapes and terms. And when it does that, we lose sight once again of Providence Island, Bermuda, and Barbados, much less Syria, Madras, and Malaysia. It's almost as if that putty is made up of some kind of narrative epoxy, whose ingredients add to the otherwise glutinous resin of history, that hardening agent of national desire. And it produces like this binding effect. It's remarkably and frustratingly resistant to change. So in what follows in the rest of this talk, I'm going to nominate three sort of integrated blocks on which we might begin to build a new global and anti-exceptionalist narrative of early American literature and history. And the first of those blocks is companies. The Virginia colonist William Strachey compared trade with the American Indians to trade with Turkey and the East Indies. Rudolph Robert observed a long time ago that Virginia was launched, he said, in a world of trade whose center still lay east in the Mediterranean and Asia. Tellingly, Robert's book is a history neither of early America nor of English colonialism, but of the chartered company. A focus on chartered and joint stock companies, I think, gives us a powerful way to globalize early American literary and cultural history. It helps us see the corporate foundations that North American colonialism, including Puritan New England, shared with English efforts around the world. The historian Alison Games offers in this book a kind of global version, if you will, of Kupperman's argument about Atlantic units. Games argues that the separation between the Atlantic and Indian Ocean worlds needs to be dismantled. She points out that this division between them is as much narrative as it is geographical. The Atlantic and American story emphasizes settlement, and the Indian and Asian story foregrounds trade. But she says the separation of these plots obscures what she calls the circular connections between trade and settlement. In his book, Philip J. Stern likewise challenges that same dichotomy, but he does it in ways that more explicitly emphasize the global importance of the early modern commercial company. So he calls into question, quote, an Atlantic history that fails to account for either enduring connections with Asia or the myriad commercial, political, and legal regimes like the company that recast the borders of the Atlantic and Asia in the first place. And Stern argues instead that the 17th century was characterized by this political mixture of empire, globalization, hybridity, and fragmentation. And those were carried out, he says, through a variety of overlapping corporate forms, including an East India Company that operated as what he calls a company state. It resembled a body politic as much as it did a commercial business. Only later, he says, were these myriad early modern corporate forms absorbed by an upstart and rival form of corporation, the nation state, which has since, Stern argues, so thoroughly dominated our imaginations that it's made it impossible for us to recognize its earlier precedents. Can we construct a narrative of early American literary and cultural history by going back to these earlier precedents that's animated not by specific regions or even by specific religious or linguistic traditions, but instead by this hybrid multi-corporatism of the early modern globe that includes commercial companies? Such a framework quickly reveals that Puritans in America were relative latecomers to what had already been, by the early part of the 1600s, a century-long effort at English overseas expansion. A crisis in the English cloth trade inspired aggressive searches for new export markets around the world, and those were made possible by the innovative financing model of the chartered joint stock company. Unlike the Spanish model of empire building that relied on a central powerful crown, joint stock companies were made up, as Rudolph Robert explains, of private investors with royal monopolies that made it possible to finance expensive and risky overseas ventures from India to America. The first joint stock chartered company in England was the Russia or Muscovy Company, created in 1553 to fund an expedition to reach the East through a supposed Northwest Passage. The voyage failed miserably, but its few survivors did successfully establish trade relations with the Russians, on whose northern coast they found themselves stranded. And the model of collectivized financial risk that financed the trip subsequently flourished, became a way to facilitate English commercial expansion around the world throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. So when the first minister on Providence Island, the Puritan Lewis Morgan, imagined the American Atlantic as a location that would grow cloves and pepper and nutmeg and mace, he was explicitly promoting that colony as an alternative to East Indian commerce, much as William Strachey did Virginia. English Atlantic plantations, in other words, were actively imagined within a global world of transoceanic trade. The Puritan Robert Hunt, who served as governor of the Providence Island Company, drew from his experience in the West Indies when he later led the establishment of the Asada colony in Madagascar. He modeled it explicitly on the example of Barbados. But his sources were even more global than that. Hunt compared Asada to English Virginia, to Portuguese Goa, and Dutch Batavia. These calcified geographical divisions produce stories that prevent us from seeing the global connections that informed these projects. It prevents us from seeing the global connections between their participants and the global connections between their writing. So focusing on companies helps us see beyond those divisions. As my opening examples of the London-based Boyle and Warwick suggest, those involved with joint stock companies most often invested in many companies at once. Approximately a third of the investors in the Levant Company, for example, were also members of the East India Company. Leadership within these companies also entailed substantial overlap. As the example of Sir Thomas Smythe attests, he was governor of the Muscovy Company, governor of the Levant Company, governor of the East India Company, treasurer of the Virginia Company, and he invested in the French, Northwest Passage, and Bermuda companies. So the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Ocean worlds come together in the early modern portfolios of such men. The story of any one company is often a story of many companies, especially as so many of these were restructured after experiences of previous financial failure. So, for example, the Massachusetts Bay Company ended up combining the leftover assets of the previously failed Dorchester Company with the land grant of the earlier New England Company. The cloth trade crisis that triggered merchant investment in so many of these joint stock ventures also led to the diaspora of workers from England's textile industry. These included the many Puritans who migrated from Holland to North America. That included the well-known Leiden group of pilgrims who emigrated as part of the Plymouth Company, and also the Puritans who emigrated from Amsterdam as part of the Virginia Company. As April Lee Hatfield has shown, by 1622, there were more than 300 Puritans who had arrived from Amsterdam to settle on a plantation south of James River, and that number later doubled. Her research on Virginia Puritans exposes the ways in which geographical divisions become reinforced through narrative conventions. The kind of telescopic focus within dominant narratives of American literary and cultural history on simply those few migrants who came from Holland to Plymouth Plantation in New England makes it challenging for us to recognize and incorporate Puritans who migrated elsewhere, such as to Virginia. Meanwhile, and I made this argument in Folded Selves, Plymouth's status as a joint stock company gets obscured by dominant narratives that emphasize their pursuit of religious freedom. Once we recognize that Puritans moved across the Atlantic under the auspices of companies, we can begin to ask how their intertwined colonial and trade relations, networks, and experiences compare with similarly organized companies in the Indian and Pacific Ocean worlds. An emphasis on the company and its intertwined practices of commercial trade and colonial settlement counteracts the isolation of New England and other English Atlantic colonies, both from each other and from the rest of the globe. The plots that structure our narratives of these separate regions have similarly been alienated from each other, and they often depend on oppositions that really don't hold up that well once we widen our lens transoceanically. So Christopher Hodgins, for instance, observes that it is only in comparison to the super biblicists of Boston that the Virginia colony's founding rhetoric can be thought even relatively secular, since it is entirely theocentric by any measure other than New England Puritanism. Allison Games remarks that ministers were everywhere and accompanied every phase of English expansion well beyond the Atlantic. And Andrew Fitzmaurice has argued that clergy always held prominent positions in the promotion of English colonial projects. And the examples of the Virginia, Newfoundland, Plymouth, and Bermuda companies all show that ministers routinely served as company propagandists, especially through the vehicle of the sermon. So in this context, John Winthrop's hyper-canonical lay sermon, a model of Christian charity, starts to look less like a proto-national vision of American exceptionalism and more like a promotional effort on behalf of the Massachusetts Bay Company, which responded. It was a sermon that responded to the different kinds of risks taken on by investors and settlers. Scott Michelson has argued that Winthrop's audience for that sermon included, on the one hand, the larger community that was bound for Boston, made up of rich and poor. And on the other hand, a smaller group of wealthy company investors who were concerned about returns. So Winthrop's own rhetorical effort to collapse these two distinct groups into a single one has been replicated, Michelson argues, by historians and literary critics. And the national narrative established by this misreading has shaped the public reception of American literary history ever since. What might Winthrop's sermon look like in a global spatial framework that encourages us to read his text alongside sermons produced elsewhere, not only in Virginia and Newfoundland and Bermuda, but also in Indonesia, Syria, and Madras? The next part and the next block of this new foundation is violence. So far, I've made an argument for creating a global narrative for American literary and cultural history by centering the early modern chartered company. The example of a recent volume on the role of merchant companies in early American history makes it clear, however, that such a focus alone cannot dislodge the narrative epoxy effect that I described at the outset of this talk. New World, Inc., The Making of America by England's Merchant Adventurers. It's written by business journalists John Butman and Simon Target, and they argue that Plymouth Pilgrims were falsely installed as the first chapter of a story about America, whose earlier chapters have since gone missing. And those earlier chapters begin for Butman and Target with a decidedly global narrative that's characterized above all by just repeated financial failures and losses. Thomas Smythe, the London merchant mentioned earlier, with all the company investments and with very close ties to the East India and Virginia companies, emerges in their book as the central heroic figure because Smythe had absolutely unrelenting efforts to just continue pouring material resources into the financial disaster that was the Virginia Company. And they see that commitment as the thing that saved England's hitherto disastrous investments in the entire North American colonial project. So on the one hand, this book adds significant global complexity and historical depth to the story of North American English colonialism. But Butman and Target ultimately renew rather than reject a kind of tired American exceptionalism. And they essentially replace the religious city on hill with its economic equivalent of the offshore startup. They insist that America's origins lie in the heroism of business entrepreneurs. Those early modern investors, writers, and promoters like Smythe, who are the equivalents of today's venture capitalists, startup visionaries, and tech gurus. Because, in their words, these men organized, promoted, and supported hundreds of ventures, one after another, until multiple threads of failure began to stitch into a fabric of success. In the course of doing so, these early modern businessmen developed what they call the quality that Americans have come to regard as quintessentially their own: perseverance. This is exceptionalist fantasy, self-interested fiction. If we accept this fantasy and think about these companies only or largely from the perspective of their investors, we will remain blind to the considerable violence carried out by them in the pursuit of trade and profit. Butman and Target tell a story about John Dudley and Robert Kett that I think is especially telling in this regard. They introduced Dudley, who was then Earl of Warwick, as the mastermind of a group of London men who plot England's escape from economic disaster in the wake of the cloth trade crisis. Dudley rose to prominence because he led the attempt to quell the rebellion by Robert Kett in 1539 against rising inequality, wealth disparity, and the privatization of land through fencing enclosures. It was Dudley who decided to publicly execute and dismember the rebellion's participants. In their telling, Buttman and Target insist that, this is a quote from them, Dudley had little choice since Kett refused to surrender. This is entirely a story told from the perspective of business. Dudley sort of has to be redeemed in this story because Dudley was the one who would go on to recruit Sebastian Cabot to lead a quest to reach Asia in a venture organized through the mechanisms of a joint stock company. And Cabot, using language that I think is astonishingly close to what Winthrop would use a century later, explains that company members must be, quote, knit and accorded in unity, love, conformity, and obedience, end quote, in order to succeed. So on the one hand, Buttman and Target make it clear one can't tell the story of early America without also telling the story of Russia, Ireland, Calais, Antwerp, the East Indies, and the Gold Coast of Africa. But their perspective also buries the fact that one can't tell the story of early America without telling the story of violence. Thomas Hooker, the client of Warwick, who helped found the colony of Connecticut, was among those English Puritans who emigrated from Holland to New England. Before leaving England, Hooker delivered a sermon called The Danger of Desertion, which imagines God bringing destruction to the sin-racked country that he fled. Hooker's focus is specifically on England there, but he drew on a tradition of Protestant millennialism whose vision was global, as Christina Bross argues in her examination in her book, Future History, of Henry Jesse's 1650 volume called Of the Conversion of 5,900 East Indians. She describes Jesse's book as a portmanteau of globalized Christian reporting that envisions a unified worldwide evangelism movement stretching from the East to the West Indies. But Bross makes clear that this worldwide movement was also yoked to practices of violence that constitute what she calls a thread running throughout the ideas of expansion and of English empire building. Jesse's volume appeared in a decade that saw renewed print attention to the earlier 1623 Amboina Massacre, which erupted in Indonesia out of tensions between the English and Dutch East India companies over access to the spice trade. And Jesse's own, I'm quoting from Bross here, celebration of worldwide Protestant brotherhood elides the violent wars and other incursions, the Pequot War, the Banda War, the enslaving of indigenous peoples in the East and West Indies that made conversion efforts possible. The massacre of the Pequot peoples at Mystic Fort in Connecticut took place in 1637. That was the year after Hooker arrived in Hartford. It was the same year that Theophilus Eaton, the guy who would become the first governor of nearby New Haven, arrived in New England. Wendy Warren has identified the year following the Pequot Massacre, 1638, as the moment when the first known slaving voyage to and from New England took place. It was the year the first Africans arrived from the West Indies to New England. It was also the first year that the first enslaved Native Americans were shipped to the West Indies. Warren goes on to observe that in this year, quote, only 8 years after the founding of the famed Massachusetts Bay Colony, less than 2 decades after the celebrated Pilgrims founded the equally mythologized Plymouth Colony, an enslaved African woman on an island in Boston's harbor was anguished because another slave had raped her upon their mutual owner's orders so that he might own a breed of Negroes. Warren's sentence sets traditional narratives about the famed, celebrated, and mythologized features of early America against other stories about the enslaved, the anguished, and the raped. Her book, which unearths the long overlooked history of slavery in colonial New England, also unearths the often brutal violence, which that traditional narrative prevents us from seeing. By placing the Indonesian massacre at Amboina in transoceanic dialogue with the Connecticut massacre in Mystic, Bross similarly counteracts the more celebratory account of 17th century English cosmopolitanism that was offered by Alison Games in her book, Web of Empire. Games argues that forceful imperial violence began to dominate England's global efforts only with Cromwell's Western design, with the emergence of a centralized state. It may be the case that the centralized state arrived later, but the coercion was always there. In fact, we can see joint stock companies as a mechanism that delivered such coercion in global colonial contexts that were fraught with danger and risk. Joint stock companies were alliances between private funds and state interests, and they outsourced military might by putting these ventures into the hands of private investors, a practice that kept them at a distance from, while still serving the goals of the crown. So to this extent, these companies operated as what I called in my most recent book, one of the battering rams of the phenomenon that Sven Beckert calls war capitalism. In his History of Cotton, Beckert argues that war capitalism began to develop in the 16th century as a way of extracting land and labor from distant locations around the globe, and it lasted in many parts of the globe until well into the 19th century. And he uses the term war capitalism to represent the period preceding 19th century industrial capitalism, rather than the traditional term mercantile capitalism, because he says war capitalism better communicates the rawness and violence of its practices and efforts. For Beckert, only a global history of capitalism effectively illustrates the centrality of violence to the profitable collaboration between the state and private enterprise throughout this phase. So adopting the framework of global war capitalism here would suggest that the joint stock company partnered with settler colonialism by pairing existing mechanisms of joint stock investment with an institutionalization of violent tactics that helped to reduce the continued financial risks and losses that were associated with the former. So the transformation toward a more centralized proto-empire under Cromwell took place in the name of a global vision of Protestantism that existed for much longer. As far back as 1577, Sir Francis Drake carried into the Pacific a book by John Dee called General and Rare Memorials, and that book contained a vision of a Protestant cosmopolis that would erase papal boundaries. Hodgkins makes clear the emerging racial terms of this vision. He observes that the Protestant imagination gradually and uneasily articulated the metaphysics of racial hierarchy, providing the apologia for binding some peoples over to landlessness and binding others under in slavery. Elizabeth Cheppy has recently argued that such a metaphysics of racial hierarchy also developed within New England Puritan theology, where its persistent language of service and mastery came into contact and ultimately into alignment with Atlantic slavery. Cheppy's project offers a fundamental rethinking of the Weberian alliance between Puritanism and capitalism by recognizing the critical role played by racial slavery. So the virtues of industry and frugality that were associated by Weber with capitalist spirit, Cheppy argues these were actually forged in the master-servant lived metaphors of vocation. She demonstrates the act of serving oneself, and this was an act seen as hypocritical by Puritans, was transformed into the virtuous practice of self-mastery through the crucible of race, distinguished white servants from Black slaves. So the spirit of capitalism is not just the spirit of self-mastery, it's the spirit of white mastery over non-white others. Pairing Cheppy's literary analysis of New England discourse with Warren's social history of New England slavery, I think gives us a completely different narrative about American Puritanism, one that's embedded within a larger, more global context, riven with racial inequality and its exploitative violence. So these new frameworks raise questions that sit a little bit uneasily within existing narratives about English colonialism. What is the legacy of Puritan radicalism across the globe? How can we make sense of humanistic commitments to the common good and civic virtue on the one hand, and acts of violence and self-interest on the other? Can our answers to such questions dissolve the putty that holds triumphalist and exceptionalist narratives of early American history together? Any new narratives of early American culture must grapple with the reality of colonial and commercial violence, with the conflicted and ambivalent responses to it, and with the role that an emerging racialized discourse played in it. The final part here is the briefest. So I'm going to conclude with some thoughts on translation. But translation is, for me, the third and last of these building blocks. In 1639, the Puritan minister, Patrick Copland, wrote to John Winthrop. He wanted to tell him about a Japanese language catechism that he had acquired. Copland was associated with the Virginia Company. He was a rector for a proposed college that never materialized, and he was the writer of a promotional sermon. It was written the same year that Robert Cushman in Plymouth delivered a sermon that drew on similar influences. Copland was interested in the conversion of the Indians, and perhaps he saw the Japanese text as an example for England's Atlantic colonies, imagining translation as a means to a global Protestantism, as Pocock did in Syria, as Boyle did in London, as Hyde did in Malaysia, Eliot in Massachusetts, and Roger Williams in Rhode Island. One argument I have been making is that we ought to be reading these otherwise far-flung writers together, despite the geographical distances and theological differences that separate them. Another argument I want to make, however, is that the global project of English overseas expansion and the place of American Puritanism within it cannot be understood without a richer and fuller engagement with translated texts. So I want to conclude with just this brief turn towards translation, both as a practice and a corpus that I think deserve greater attention. Nan Goodman reminds us that there was a glut, she says, of printed materials about the Ottomans that circulated in the 17th century. And she says Cotton Mather's library contained copies of some of those materials. She identifies an overlooked Puritan, quote, sense of kinship with and belonging to a larger, more inclusive world that she locates in texts like a 1698 Puritan New England broadside called The Turkish Fast. In addition to reading Latin, Hebrew, ancient Greek, Spanish, and German, Cotton Mather also corresponded with a German missionary named Ziegenblau, who was stationed in Tranquebar, which is now Tarangambadi on the Tamil Nadu coast of India. When Mather sent Ziegenblau a copy of his 1721 volume India Christiania, he inserted into it a 5-page bilingual text that was in English and Wampanoag, a missive that recalls Copland's message to Winthrop nearly a century earlier about the Japanese language catechism, but also calls to mind the translation work of Hyde, Pocock, Eliot, Williams. Through such evidence, Goodman offers us a cosmopolitan Cotton Mather, whose pietism, she says, allowed for the kind of dialogue that transcends cultural and linguistic boundaries. This Cotton Mather, this sort of Puritan internalized cosmopolitanism, corresponds pretty neatly to the model of global English cosmopolitanism developed by Alison Gaines. Now, I do think it's important that we restore this global and translingual dimension to our understanding of New England Puritanism. But this model of a kind of celebratory Puritan cosmopolitanism, I don't think will serve us especially well unless it also makes room for the profoundly racist Cotton Mather who emerges from Cheppy's careful reading of his language of service and mastery. Ross describes this period as one that's imbued with global sensibilities, partly because there were so many books circulated to English readers that contain news about Africa, the Levant, Russia, the East Indies, the Americas. And collections like those by Richard Hakluyt brought together for readers descriptions of the East with those of the West. But those collections were rife with translations. We often characterize these works today as travel literature, but Fitzmaurice points out they were really works of colonial promotion. These widely circulating translations simultaneously fueled visions of global Protestantism, global trade, and global colonialism. The complex relationship of those visions to each other gives us a starting point for new accounts of early America in global context. Our scholarly hesitancy to study texts in translation is evidence of the accumulation of separate linguistic units, much like their historical and geographical counterparts, that have sometimes prevented us from pursuing global alternatives to our calcified narratives of early American history. But this literary and cultural history of translation, if we combine it with a focus on global joint stock companies and a recognition of war capitalism's history of global violence, might provide the building blocks for scholars and students to write new narratives about America's colonial origins, its Puritan and other writers and settlers, and their relationship to the rest of the world. I just want to conclude by thanking Chris Bross and Abram Van Engen, whose invitation to contribute to this forthcoming volume inspired these reflections, this talk, and thanks to all of you for listening. I am very happy to stop talking and answer questions.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for that fantastic talk. I think that I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions. I think the best way to run it perhaps is if you have a question, just type up in the chat, in the kind of global chat, and I'll just ask you to turn your mic on. Maybe while we're waiting, I can ask the first question, Michelle.
Absolutely.
So you made a really good case for the fact that we need to try to replace the exceptionalist narrative of American national history and also American literary history, and think more about the role of the company and the global company in the founding of the various colonies of North America, as well as Asia and Africa as well. So maybe I can ask a question about literary genre to take it to literature. So if we have, most of us are familiar with the idea of epic, let's say, as a kind of national or proto-national genre. And in an American studies context, a lot of us are familiar with the Jeremiad in the traditional model of a kind of the Jeremiad as a kind of Jeremiad sermon as a kind of proto-national, and this reading is contested, but it's kind of seen as a proto-national genre. So what kind of genres should we be looking to feature in our teaching and in our scholarship that might help us to try to foreground this kind of idea of a company literature?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Christopher. That's a great one. I think the obvious one that kept coming up in my talk is the sermon. But at the same time, there's an encouragement to think about the sermon as to think about genre, to stretch our ideas about genre, to understand the kind of work that they're doing. And sometimes sort of our own genre categories don't mean the same thing in these older historical contexts. So thinking about about sermons as a form of sort of company propaganda not only allows us to bring sermons from all around the globe together, but it allows us to think about those works as something much more than just sort of religious pulpit communications, but that they're doing much more complicated work. And I think that actually that reframing of genre will help scholars and students see what these sermons from around the world might share in ways that we wouldn't be able to recognize if we just simply put together an anthology of early modern sermons from around the world, right? So sermons are one answer. The genre of what we now call sort of travel narratives, but again, that Fitzmaurice suggests was a form of colonial promotion, I think is another category. I recently, and I guess one of the arguments that I'm making here is that we should be reading also the kinds of texts that we maybe don't typically see as literary, but read them in literary ways to try to understand how they facilitated this kind of global corporate and colonial enterprise. So I recently read a manuscript that gave an extraordinary close reading of like a 7-line contract, legal contract, right? So especially because, right, this 17th century is a period that's filled full of, you know, few texts that we recognize as obviously literary given our contemporary assumptions. There are ways to make 17th century writing literary, right? Approach it in a literary way that I think not only opens them up to us as readers, but helps us understand how they worked and the power that they have. And if we don't approach them in these ways to try to rhetorically understand what kind of effect they had on the world around them, then we sort of allow them to continue having that effect, right? So thank you for that question.
Thanks, great answer. Thank you so much for that. So we've got a couple of questions in for Kevin and Miles. I'll call on Kevin first, my colleague Kevin Reardon.
Hi, can you hear me, Chris? Okay, great. Sorry, I went silent in the queue, so sorry to jump your thoughtful question here, Miles. Thank you, Professor Burnham, for this talk. I work in a later period, but with a lot of the same issues. And I liked your turn at the end to translation, which is something I think about a lot. And I'm just wondering how in the period, you know, you started with that cover page of the Malay translation. You know, oftentimes we turn as cosmopolitan scholars to translation as a way of moving in different ways. And I'm just wondering, in the period that you're working with, how does the kind of print culture and the centers of print both facilitate and perhaps hold back some of our ways of thinking that translation is going to solve these issues? You know, where of these places were there the printing technologies? To what extent were things flowing back to say London to be disseminated again and then retranslated? So how do those networks work? How can we think of the network of translation, particularly via printing?
Yeah, that's really important, I think. And you know, that translation that I started with was printed in Oxford, right? So yeah, there absolutely are limits given the location of presses. And it's going to then become really important and perhaps challenging, right, to sort of track the dissemination of those texts. Obviously, it was printed in Oxford, but not for readers in Oxford, right? So where did that translation go? Who did it reach? How was it used? Those are all really, really interesting questions, very much worth pursuing. And when I'm making the argument about kind of reading more translated text, I mean it also in both directions, right? So reading texts that may have originally been in a non-English language translated into English, we're often very reluctant to read it or take it seriously on its own terms because we would default to its original language version instead. But I've been kind of making a case for reading those translations as not necessarily as their own text that got read by readers in the same way, right? So I appreciate that question, and I think that, you know, both the print history and the dissemination history of these translations is an important piece of that puzzle.
Thank you.
I would be, if we have time later, I would be happy to hear about your own work with translation that factors in here.
Miles, do you want to come on mic and ask your question? Okay, great. Thanks, Miles.
Thank you very much for your talk. I genuinely found it fascinating and really enjoyed it. I'm just wondering, in your research on this kind of global Puritan cosmopolitanism, the extent to which you've found that it cuts across class lines. So, you know, you have these fantastic examples of people holding leadership positions in the Virginia Company and the East India Company and the New England Company. You know, if you look more at working class people, say indentured servants, even slaves, do you think that they also had a sense of being embedded in some sort of global cosmopolitanism?
Yeah, in some ways, I'm going to sort of defer. The global cosmopolitan argument has sort of been made by Alison Gaines as a historian, sort of from the English direction, and then by Nan Goodman from the sort of colonial American direction. I myself, I just find limits to that,
Okay.
to the picture that they paint. My sense is that it doesn't cut across class or racial lines at all. Okay. I feel a little, I appreciate, I guess, the argument that they're making and the way that it opens up maybe some of our assumptions about Puritanism, but I also find that it's limiting in some of the exact ways that you're pointing toward.
Okay.
It may be the case, yeah, it may be that, like, it would be amazing to find that, right, others are reading these same texts, or maybe hearing, right, sort of in sermons or elsewhere, some of this information that is helping them develop this sort of global cosmopolitan consciousness, but I tend to suspect not.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for your question.
Any further questions? Thank you, guys. Cyrus, would you like to come on mic to ask your question?
Yes, thanks very much. That was a wonderful talk, and it's gotten me thinking about American exceptionalism, which is a topic I need to be thinking about this particular week, as it turns out. I'm wondering, though, about the ways in which the argument that you've presented and the rethinking that you're trying to do might serve as a way of rethinking not just American Puritanism, but also cosmopolitanism. In other words, are there lessons to be learned for somebody whose interest is primarily in theories and practices of cosmopolitanism, and perhaps the limits of those things? There are some times when cosmopolitanism can seem to be an insufficiently ironized position, or perhaps overly utopian or optimistic. So I'm wondering what cosmopolitan theorists might take away from your talk and your current work. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And I may end up turning this question back to you. But I do find that there are limits to models of cosmopolitanism and cosmopolitan theory that run into, if you take the kind of Goodman view of Cotton Mather and the Cheppy view of Cotton Mather, only one of those really is a cosmopolitan Cotton Mather that I think we can't accept alone. So I guess a critical cosmopolitanism is necessary, but I would be happy to hear sort of other thoughts from the perspective of someone who's maybe a bit more informed about cosmopolitan theory.
Well, perhaps just as an initial thought to add on that, I mean, in other words, if we want to think about rethinking Cotton Mather through a cosmopolitan lens, I think it's important to understand that racism that he has is not simply incidental, but it's actually part of, maybe you would think of as the historical limits of any kind of cosmopolitanism that might have been said to exist in the 17th century. For me, one of the most interesting aspects of cosmopolitanism is the idea that it creates conversations. A real cosmopolitanism would create conversations that are based on the idea of fallibilism. the idea of a way of rethinking human error, which strikes me at first thinking of as not really a very Puritan way of thinking about error. In other words, a cosmopolitan theorist would encourage us to embrace the idea that we are error prone, and therefore to believe that we need to listen to other people because they may have a better account of the truth. So that you might say that cosmopolitanism in that sense is fundamentally anti-fundamentalist, or somebody like Mather and other Puritans would be construed perhaps as counter-cosmopolitans. So it seems to me that one of the reasons that you might say that, Cotton Mather might be either not cosmopolitan or demonstrating the limits on any cosmopolitanism that he would have been able to have is precisely because his mindset was incapable of thinking about error in this particular way. Error was related to the total depravity of man rather than any kind of human perfectibility. So I think that might be the way that I might start to think about whether it's viable at all to use cosmopolitanism as a lens to think about the Puritans, and conversely, what if we want to think about, there are proto-cosmopolitan things going on in Puritanism, what the historical limits of those might have been, and thinking about that attitude towards error might be the place that I would start.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and it actually makes me think that then there is no early modern European cosmopolitan at all, because Puritanism may be one end of the spectrum, but I'm not sure there are many who would be sort of that open to the admission of error. But I really appreciate your first comment, which is that Mather's racism is a piece of his, and maybe many others, cosmopolitanism. So thank you.
Thank you for that question, Cyrus. Any further questions? One thing, while we wait to see if there's a further question, I might chip in on that last issue. I think you can, if you're looking at Cotton Mather, as and I agree with both of you that we maybe need to be skeptical of the Nangama model of Mather as a cosmopolitan. I think if you look at his vision of the millennium, that's another way in which we can kind of contest that reading, because it's kind of a fundamentally almost imperialist or colonial view, in that you have a center, the New Jerusalem, which is then kind of responsible for Christianizing the rest of the world, and so it's almost like it's rather than a kind of obliteration of ethnic and political difference. In a way, it's kind of a reduplication of it, actually. So Gilman tends to make the case that these differences will be completely elided in Mather's millennium, but in fact, in a way, it's just kind of more of the same, just on a kind of supernatural level. Shirley, it looks like you have a question.
I don't know how to send it across.
You could go ahead. Go ahead.
I just wondered, thank you very much for this very impressive talk this morning with its geographical reach and historical depth. I just wondered, since the field I'm involved with is in British colonialism, post-colonial studies, to what extent did 1783 diminish or undo some of those global lines which you have so eloquently laid down this morning? I mean, was it the rise of the nation state in America? Was it the violence and conquest of the Napoleonic Wars that then made the British presence in the East Indies so very marked? And we don't hear very much of, well, perhaps it's, I should be doing some serious reading of the American presence.
I may have missed the date that you mentioned earlier. Was it 1783? Is that what you said?
The Paris Treaty, the loss of the American colonies.
Okay, yeah. I probably can't answer the specificity of your question as far as, you know, the change in the view of the British presence in Asia or in the East Indies. But that period, the end of the 18th century, is actually the period that I focused on in my most recent book. And that's a period that I thought of as, right, sort of the age of revolutions, but also in which the American Revolution takes place, which is another, right, it's together with the Puritans, it's like our narratives of American literary and cultural history are really efforts to tie that American Revolutionary period to the Puritans and then anything that, right, sort of came afterwards. So going back to the Philip Stern book and his argument about the company state, right, he sort of makes that argument that we've become almost incapable of imagining some of these early modern corporate forms because our minds have become so colonized by the nation state that we kind of can't imagine any other right, sort of forms of belonging. So I suspect that that is part of it.
Well, as you mentioned, you know, there was a lot of conflict between the people stationed on the spot, like Raffles, for example, and what is going on with the East India Company governors in London. Yeah, so that was what you make very clear in speaking of the, well, in those days, I suppose English Americans working for companies. Yeah. Thank you. I'll read your other work that you mentioned.
I appreciate that.
Perhaps we have time for one further question if anyone would like to ask one. We've had some really good ones so far. Okay, I think in that case, maybe we can draw to a close. Thank you so much, Michelle, for a wonderful talk. And thank you everyone for joining us. Maybe I'll use this as an opportunity to plug the next talk, which I think is, yes, next Friday, the 11th. And it's Claire Colebrook from Penn State University is talking on rhizomes and the paradox of posthumanism. So that should be very interesting. Hope to see some of you there. Meanwhile, I don't really know what the etiquette is for applauding. I guess I do that, and then thank you so much, Michelle, for a wonderful
thank you, Christopher, for this invitation. And I do want to say that, you know, I hope the Zoom format made it okay to listen, but what it has also made possible is for us to have this very international exchange. Like it's really delightful to see all of you from on the other side of the world and to share our work. So I guess I hope we can do more of this. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you, everyone.